Poštovani gledalci, proteklih nekoliko sedmica se raspravlja o takozvanim non-paperima ili mišljenjima određenih strana kada je u pitanju region Zapadnog Balkana. Jedan od onih koji su ponudili svoj non-paper, svoje mišljenje o stanju na Zapadnom Balkanu je profesor N1 Serwer, profesor Johns Hopkins univerziteta u Washingtonu i jedan od onih analitičara koji su konstantno prisutni kada se govori o Zapadnom Balkanu. Professor Serwer, welcome to program N1.
My pleasure.
Usually when we speak, is something big is happening in the Western Balkans. We are seeing a wave of non-papers. Many here are saying that we shouldn't pay attention to the non-papers, but the people in diplomacy are saying you should be aware of the non-papers because the non-papers are always testing balloons. So one of the diplomats and high-ranking diplomats, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Germany, Heiko Maas, says on a press conference with his Northern Macedonia colleague, I quote him, regarding these non-papers, the non-papers bear the right name, non-paper. They are nothing but hot air, and no one should intensively deal with them. There is also no German involvement whatsoever in any non-papers. If there are rumors to that effect, it's a fake news. It has always been a principle of German foreign policy on the Western Balkans not to touch borders. But my question to you is, if Heiko Maas is so strongly saying that they don't have any connection with these non-papers, something is there, and these non-papers are causing reason for reaction, right?
Well, they're causing reactions because they put forward ideas that are terrible ideas that have been rejected repeatedly. They do it in a format that is used by diplomats a great deal, the so-called non-paper. But it is important to recognize that anybody can write a non-paper. So I wrote my own as well, which is diametrically opposed to the ideas put forward in the two other non-papers that have come out recently. So, you know, I'm glad to hear that the Germans reject the movement of borders completely. I agree with that. It seems to me that his statement is very clear on that subject. And it should be taken very seriously because it's not only a position of the German foreign ministry, it's a position of many in the German parliament as well. And that's very important because the parliament would have to ratify membership of any country that had altered borders in the meanwhile. It's not going to happen. But it's very destabilizing even to promote these ideas. And I have to doubt the goodwill of those who continue to put them forward.
Let me start with the first non-paper to which we know who the authors are. That's Croatia and several other countries. And that non-paper is delivered to the High Representative of the European Union, Josep Borrell, and should be discussed on the next Foreign Affairs Council of the European Union, which is scheduled for the next week. But in that non-paper, we have shown from Croatia all the usuals, the electoral law in Bosnia and Hercegovina, all the reforms, and moving forward towards European Union. And we know that the Grlić Radman, Foreign Affairs Minister of Croatia, has prepared that one in collaboration with Dragan Čović and HDZ in Bosnia and Herzegovina. What is your opinion on that one?
Well, I'm really tired of the efforts by a rather small population in Bosnia and Herzegovina to gain essentially a separate entity. And that's what lurks behind this non-paper, is the idea that only Croats should vote for Croat representatives in at all levels in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And, that's not a liberal democratic system. That's a system of ethnic identification. It's a system that really is unacceptable in most of Europe. Admittedly, Belgium has something like it, but I don't believe for a moment that anybody wants to import another Belgium into the European Union. It's a way of keeping Bosnia and Herzegovina out forever.
Now, the second one, which is far more dangerous one, so-called Janša non-paper, which many here in the Western Balkans are saying that probably wasn't authored by Slovenian Prime Minister Janez Janša, but by some other political players in wider regional politics, is talking about finalization of what has started in 1990s with the dissolution of former Yugoslavia, dissolution of Bosnia and Herzegovina, territorial exchanges in between Serbia and Kosovo. So my question is, can that one be realized? And should we expect that anyone should have illusions that that one can be realized with, for example, Anthony Blinken in State Department, and he very well knows how situation was played here in 1990s?
The way I read the official U.S. statements, they are thoroughly, deeply committed to the territorial integrity and sovereignty of each of the current states in the Balkans. And that means that this kind of territorial exchange would be unacceptable to the Americans, as it is also to the Germans. Finally, the idea of completing the process of dissolution of former Yugoslavia is not one I completely disagree with. I believe in completing it as well, and completing it with the creation of nothing but liberal democracies that can qualify for membership in NATO and the European Union. And that's the kind of completion that I would want to see, with everybody having equal rights, with freedom of the press, with independent judiciaries. The Copenhagen criteria are really very clear, and efforts to escape them and still make your way to the European Union are a great mistake. Years ago, there was a president of Croatia in Washington who was selling the third entity idea. And, my question to him was, would he—
I believe that was a President Tudjman.
It wasn't Tudjman, it was after Tudjman. I asked him, would he give to the Serbs in Croatia the kinds of institutional separation that he was arguing for Croats inside Bosnia? Of course, the answer is no. And that's the first test of all of these ideas. The first test should be, if you're asking for something, would you give it in your own country? If you want an association of Serb-majority municipalities in Kosovo with executive authority, would you give the same to the Albanian majority municipalities inside Serbia? And it's on that basis of reciprocity that so many of these ideas fail.
Another element is we have another non-paper for which Serbian President Aleksandar Vučić, whom you know very well, I must say, that says that he knows who the authors are. That's the third one related to Serbia and Kosovo, and it talks about all the different possibilities and relations. And we have some analysts such as Timothy Less from United Kingdom, who are coming with their own ideas and their own projections of the situation. What can be a result of all these games regarding the situation here in the Western Balkans with all these non-papers?
I think the result intellectually is less than zero. They contribute nothing and they subtract a good deal. But they're still very dangerous papers because they get people excited and they revive ideas like Greater Serbia, Greater Albania, Greater Kosovo, and they create expectations. And expectations can make people move, as we know from the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina.
Sorry to interrupt you, but Matthew Palmer from the State Department in our program, N1, he also mentioned the word great, but he says that he wants to see great Bosnia, but not in a territorial element, but as a state and as a functional state to have a greater Bosnia. Should that be our aim through some new non-papers or new initiatives to change the situation here, or these non-papers are coming out just because Bosnia and Serbia are going in electoral years next year?
Well, I can't comment on the motives of the people who write the non-papers because I don't really know who they are, but I agree with Matt Palmer that what we need is a better Bosnia and Herzegovina, one that's more functional. And the paper you want to look at in that respect is the one that was published some months ago by the Woodrow Wilson Center, which is not a non-paper. It's signed by a number of us. And that paper proposes a sharp reduction in the salience of the entities and the cantons in favor of strengthening the Sarajevo government with respect to those things that are required for European Union membership, and the municipalities for all those things that are not required for European Union membership. That idea, to me, has real possibility of improving the functionality of Bosnia and Herzegovina. It would allow majority Croat municipalities to have much stronger powers than they have today, majority Serb municipalities. But it would also strengthen the Sarajevo government in those respects that are required for European Union membership.
Before I ask you something about your own proposal for the non-paper and solutions, the Minister of Internal Affairs of Serbia, Aleksandar Vulin, has said that he is requesting, I quote him, "I request from the President Vučić to refuse conversation about recognition and to say to the big countries which wrote this non-paper that the resolution of a question of Kosovo and Metohija can't be found without solution for Republika Srpska and the national question of Serbs in entirety." So Minister Vulin wants to find a solution for all Serbs in entirety, but that is a solution which would require much more than Bosnia and Herzegovina and Serbia and Kosovo, because we have Serbs in Croatia, we also have Serbs in Montenegro, we also have some of them in Macedonia. This would be another wide Balkans situation, if I correctly judge what he's asking at this moment. Can this be done? And is this just one of his usual testing balloons?
I think it's a test balloon. I think that's exactly what it is. I think it comes not from Vulin, but from the president. I think Serbia has been testing how far it can go when talking about Greater Serbia without arousing a serious reaction. And I think there should be a serious reaction to Vulin, who is the pure offspring of the Milosevic regime, in this case of Mira Markovic, but still very much an offspring of the Milosevic regime, which placed all its cards in the end on the greatest Serbia idea and was defeated in war after war. You would think that the defense minister of Serbia, of all people, would be aware of the tragedy that this idea brought upon Serbia. And the only sense in which it created a home for all Serbs was that Serbia had to absorb a very large number of refugees from other countries. This is a tragedy for Belgrade. This is not a good idea. And it seems to me Vulin should get the reaction they're looking for.
Now, I mentioned several times during this interview that you prepared your own non-paper. You have your own ideas for the Western Balkans. So tell us, what is your idea for the Western Balkans?
Well, I don't think that anything can be done quickly or easily in the Western Balkans today. These are transitional hybrid regimes which are partly democratic, and the governments in them are partly democratically validated, and they need to reflect to a very large degree the sentiments of their populations, their citizens. With respect to Kosovo, I think the governments in Kosovo have changed very rapidly over recent years, but in practice, they have all been committed to the same thing, which is recognition of sovereignty and territorial integrity of their state, building of their state. The area of weakness I would identify in Kosovo is the relationship between that state and the Kosovo Serbs. And I think that relationship needs to be strengthened and improved, and it has to be made absolutely clear by the government in Pristina that the Kosovo Serbs are full-fledged citizens of Kosovo, that their rights will be respected, their property will be respected, their security will be respected. And that includes the property and security of the Serbian Orthodox Church in Kosovo as well. And there's a constitutional court decision on one property issue with respect to the monastery in Dečani that has never been implemented, and that's inexcusable. So I think at one point Albin Kurti was talking about the idea of a dialogue with the Kosovo Serbs and his new government, and I think that's an excellent idea and one that could have very positive results. And frankly, if I had my druthers, that Kosovo Serb population would be represented at some point in the dialogue with Serbia. With respect to Serbia, I think there's also a need for more communication between the government and the citizens. The government in Serbia is a now it's classified as a hybrid regime. I would call it a semi-authoritarian regime. And it needs to have a much franker dialogue with its own citizens about why sovereignty was lost over Kosovo in the 1990s, and why it is unimaginable that Belgrade will ever again govern the Kosovo Albanians, and why they have to also surrender governing authority over the Kosovo Serbs. That Kosovo is now a separate country, and while it is perfectly legitimate for Belgrade to be concerned about the welfare of the Kosovo Serbs, it is not legitimate to try to control their political fate or their governance. And, to me, to rush into, you can have dialogue on many issues. Certainly the missing people issue should have been settled long ago. The financial issue should be settled. The implementation of the existing agreement should be done. But I think it's foolhardy to anticipate a quick resolution between Belgrade and Pristina. I think President Vučić made it absolutely clear that he's not going to recognize Kosovo before the next Serbian presidential election. So I think we have to admit the obvious, which is that there's another year or so of hard work at the more technical level before there'll be a real resolution.
What about Bosnia and Herzegovina? What we should do now, because we are going into the next parliamentary elections next year, and we are seeing again conversations about wars and separations and referendums, and those are usual elements which are coming from Mr. Dodik usually ahead of the elections. President Izetbegovic, president of the SDA, has said recently that if there is a new war, he would be in the first lines in front of his people to find. We hear from Mr. Čović that his way of adopting the new electoral law is the only solution for this situation. The government of federation was not formed for 4 years now, 2 years after or almost 3 years after the elections. So what is your view for Bosnia?
Well, I think I already said something about it. I think you need a more functional Bosnian state. I think that means moving some decisions up to the Sarajevo level that now are taken at the entity level, and moving other decisions now taken at the entity and cantonal levels down to the municipal level. I think the municipal governments have demonstrated repeatedly that they have better potential for satisfying the needs of citizens than the governments at the other levels. But you need a functional government at the Sarajevo level to negotiate and implement the acquis communautaire. And so you have to have that as well. But to me, I mean, the essential thing I was told during the war by Krasimir Čubak, the then Croat leader in the federation, I was told, look, sir, where you've got to understand one man, one vote will never work here in Herzegovina. And that's what Čović is still saying. I don't believe that. I'm a minority in the United States. I enjoy the full protection of the rule of law, and I enjoy having the privileges that are associated with the majority in the United States. And I wish everybody here could say the same thing. I don't think everybody can. But, you know, one person, one vote has enormous virtues, not the least of which is that politicians would have to reach beyond their own ethnic group to get votes. And the Croats, the nationalist Croats, complain bitterly when that's done in Bosnia and Herzegovina. It actually is a sign of democratic maturity that people are paying attention to somebody other than their own ethnic group when they go to the polling place. Frankly, also, the Bosniaks will always, as the majority population, plurality population, in fact, majority population, they'll always be split. They'll never be completely united. And that means that small numbers, relatively small numbers, like the numbers of Croats, numbers of Serbs are somewhat larger, will always be politically very important because they'll be required to form governments. So look, you know, for those of us who spent the wartime years trying to end the horrific violence against citizens in Bosnia and Herzegovina, to hear proposals about how only Croats should vote for Croats and only Serbs vote for Serbs, these propositions to me are just war by political means is what it seems to me. And that could lead to real war. If there's a real war, of course, we'll all expect it to be very short. I think the international community should make sure that it's very short, mainly by ensuring that Britko does not fall to either side in a future war. Britko is the center of gravity of wartime Bosnia and needs to be protected from anyone who wants to seize it. It's a great success politically in Bosnia, and that success has to be defended.
Professor, for the last question in this interview, you know Tony Blinken very well, and he has a full plate of his issues on his plate at the moment, and far bigger than the Western Balkans and far serious than the Western Balkans. But also there could be a change of a government in Germany because the Greens are rising up in election polls. Should we expect any move by international community in the Western Balkans before we see the resolution of the situation in Germany and France, when Biden and Blinken will have more clear situation, what will be the position of the two largest and strongest countries in the European Union?
Well, I don't anticipate that the position of Germany would change even if its government changes, because there's broad parliamentary support for the position you read of the current foreign minister: no border changes, period. Now that idea originates with the French, of course. It originates with the Benter Commission and that ruled in the breakup of Yugoslavia that there would be no border changes to accommodate ethnic differences, only changes of status of different borders in the Balkans. But the French, for reasons that I have never quite understood, are less wedded to the Benter Commission decisions than the Germans and the Americans and lots of other people as well, the Brits. Look, border changes can happen in the Balkans. The only way they're going to happen is by use of force. And the use of force will create very large numbers of refugees and lead to a disaster that all of us would be best advised to avoid.
Professor, thank you so very much for your time in this interview.
You're welcome.
Poštovani gledalci, bio ovo intervju sa profesorom Danielom Serwerom. Razgovarali smo o famoznim non-paperima i o mogućim i potencijalnim rješenjima za područje Zapadnog Balkana. Ostanite dalje uz program N1. Doviđenja.